Hi, my name is Jack Curran and I'm a black and white landscape photographer. Welcome and thank you for watching my video tutorials. I have a Mastery of Light series that has long form and short form video tutorials. This will be a short form video tutorial where the complexity of what we're trying to accomplish here isn't terribly hard, but I really hope that by doing some of these shorter videos people will understand that there are some simple things that you can do to really get some powerful results. Again, when I think about the way I do things today, I really think about myself as being kind of old school using new tools. I printed in the darkroom for nearly 30 years, maybe a little over 30 years actually. And what I did there with dodging and burning and chemistry and pin registration and masking and selenium toning negatives is all some of the same kind of approach that I bring today, but now I'm using digital tools in Lightroom, and that's kind of what I want to share with you today because I can refine things a lot easier than having to work 2-3 weeks and taking notes, but applying that same aesthetic principles that I've been using for the last 35, nearly 40 years. So the image that we have here is Skogafoss Falls, and that was taken in Iceland. It was probably 11:45, almost midnight when I took this. So it's that time of day in Iceland where the sun never quite goes down all the way, and there's this very low illumination of light. So everything here was pretty much in shadow. As you can see from this file, it's very dark. I think this was probably a 8, 9, 10-minute exposure, trying to get to some kind of light. I mean, I think I tried this like 8 or 9 times before I finally got to the place where I had some registration of light coming through. But I'll share with you how I do this conversion and how we can build luminosity in the image versus just luminance. How to pull detail out of the shadows and still try and pull without losing the interest, and trying to create depth, because in a scene like this it's really hard to create depth when everything's kind of mushed together in that grayscale tone. Okay, so as I was talking about a second ago, one of the things that's very challenging about a scene like this is there's a very short dynamic range. It means that my shadows and highlights are kind of squished together, and if you think about it in terms of black and white, you don't have a lot of zones or tonal range. So it becomes very challenging to pull those out of the image and extend that range and create enough visual interest. Fortunately, I do have enough range with the waterfall and the sky to kind of really push those into the point where I can create luminosity around those and then create some texture and depth on the sides to help with that. All right, first I want to just kind of share with you, if you see right here, there's this mountain, or let's just call it a cliff face over here, but there are little highlights and textures in here. So what we're going to try and do is we're going to pull out the highlight plus texture over here and look for try and create a little contrast. There's more highlights here. There's all these highlights down in here. We're going to go ahead and pull those out, and then there's a little bit of water over in here, right? And then if you can kind of see it here, there is this mist, and what we're going to do is we're going to extend this up this way and pull that highlight so that it takes this rock that's right here and kind of goes behind that rock. Then we're going to take this and we're going to really pump up the highlight here. And then we're going to use the sky here, and we're going to make it much darker. So we're going to make that darker and push that down here so that we have almost a glow across the top. And there's subtle details all in here where we're looking for the highlights, details, contrast, and texture in here to help add depth in the entire scene. So you can kind of see what we're going to try and do here as far as the overall image. And where we're trying to go with it is right here. So you can see that we've kind of established some of those different areas down here. We've got that rock a little harder, the highlights. So, whoops. So let's go ahead and, you know, get started and see if we can't get that, show you some of the tools and techniques that we're using. And again, they're not really complicated, but it just takes a little bit of time and a little patience to layer in all these different tools and techniques. All right, here we go. So one of the first things that we want to do here is we want to take a look at the highlights and the shadows. So let me just go ahead and do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this about as dark as I can. I want to see where that's going, and then I want to kind of just see where the detail is. So I've taken it down, and I just barely see some detail down in here. I see some in here, and of course I can see how the sky is going darker here. Now I can push that sky a little farther and see how dark I can take it. Now I can do this, then I can do that, and I can really see what's going on with the sky there, right? So let me just take this back up. Now if I go the other way and I really open it up and I start taking the black down, now I see where my edges are and my highlights here. So there's a lot more texture in there than what appeared in the raw file. I can now see all this detail down here in the foreground. I can see a lot up here in the mountain ridge lines or the cliff ridge lines, and I see the glow from the mist kind of extending way out and behind this rock. So now I've got a really good idea of, you know, what all that is looking like. So I'm going to go back here. I'll probably put it, just zero that out, and that kind of give me you know, where I'm sitting with this. Now I had made a TIFF file copy of my CR2 file, so we're just going to start with this real quick. And again, as I've mentioned several times now, when I do my initial black and white conversion, I don't do a lot of presets because I really like to go through the process, and the more I can go through the process with you, the viewer, the more I think you'll gain as far as how this happens and how you can do it yourself. When you do presets, it jumps right to a, as it indicates, a preset developed area, whether it's increasing saturation, highlights, contrast, clarity, all those kinds of different things, and you don't know how you got there. So I like to gradually build it up myself, and I find that that's really important here. You'll also notice that the histogram up here shows a lot of, you know, a lot of shadow with the peaks and the highlights, right? So there's not a lot to gain from the histogram. And when we work in black and white, you know, if you just convert this really quickly, you'll see that it's kind of got middle tone, it's got a blast in the highlight, and then it's got, you know, the shadows. So it's kind of toned down to one end. Again, I don't typically use the histogram to really give me an indication of what's going on, because what I like to do is work from an aesthetic point of view first, and then I might go back and look at the data and the details, but I really want to see what's going on aesthetically. I know you can learn a lot from the histogram, and I think it's an important tool in some places, but for me, I like to look at the image first, think about it aesthetically, similar to what I showed you when I was doing the drawings on there on how I was going to approach it. So let me just show you what I've done. I've done a straight conversion. I'm going to take a big radial filter. Whoop, let me reset that. Maybe a little bigger than that, a little wider than that. And I'm going to invert that. I'm going to use the invert button down here. You'll notice that my feather is still up pretty high. My feather is usually around 80 to 90, somewhere in that range. I like a nice soft feather. And then I'm going to pull that down and kind of just get it about as moody as I can. I might lower that a little so that my sky goes a little darker and my highlights down here start to, you know, stay kind of in that range. And then I'm not going to do anything with contrast or clarity or any of that just yet. So then I'm going to go back, I'm going to do another one, And this time, let me reset that. I'm going to go in here and I am going to go back and just use the highlights, the whites a little bit, but we're going to go back and we're going to build that in. A little bit of exposure. Now, you'll see that I'm starting to get a little detail in here in the rocks and a little detail here in the rocks, but it's not going to help me because I'm going to really push those in a minute or two. Now, let's do this. I'm going to get a graduated filter here, and I really want to pull down that sky. I need to double click that. I should probably just reset that. I'm going to shorten that a little so it doesn't get too much of the top of the fall. Bring it down. Now I'm going to pull that down a little because I want the sky to go darker. And you can see I'm starting to get that little glow above the waterfall that I talked about. But you'll also see that the tops of these mountains over here are going very dark. So what I'm going to do here is I'm also going to get a brush. And I've got my brush down here. I'm going to get my size, take my hardness off. I got my auto mask on, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take my density down and my flow down so I'm not too heavy. If I'm too heavy, I can't, go in there and really brush. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to hit the erase button, double check those, feather, flow, size, and then I'm going to erase some of that darkness and detail that I put in there before. I'm going to erase some of that out of the gradation and see if I can't bring that back. I may have to do this 2 or 3 times, but you can see it's not as jet black. It's a little hard to see, but it's not as jet black. And I've got the auto mask, which should help me with the edge up there a little bit. But now this detail right in here is starting to come back. This detail right here is coming back. And we'll bring those out a little bit more in a minute. So, but that's kind of gotten my sky into a place where it's kind of interesting the way it is now going over the waterfall. So now I've got this. I'm going to do another radial filter here. And I'm going to extend it pretty far across the scene. And I'm going to actually raise it up a little because I want to catch some of that mist. I'm going to go exposure, but I also want to pump the contrast up here and the highlights and then the clarity, because what that'll do is that'll give me separation in the midtones, and it also gives me the specular highlights in there that make those little bitty rocks that have the highlights on them pop. So I think that's important. I'm going to do another one right here. Of course, I need to reset that. And I'm going to do exposure, highlight just to add some contrast, and white to really just work the whites. Let's see what the shadows look like. I could open those up a little. Now, here's a really important one right in here, right? So this is giving me that mist that we highlighted when we first took a look at this, but we want it to stay out of here. So if we can not affect the rock too much, it'll appear to be going behind the rock. So if I work just the highlights and bring out the whites and then start doing the exposure, you can see how that's starting to glow back there. I'm going to just move that around a little bit so you can see how that works. And you can put it in closer. If you put it in closer, you'll see right in this area here it gets completely blown out. And if I show you that, you'll see it just completely blows it out. So we want to be careful that we're not doing that. I'll share a little bit more information on these highlights and shadows in a minute. So now I've got that, and I've got a little bit of detail down here. If I want to play with that a little bit more, I'm going to reset this. A little exposure, a little highlight, a little bit of white, a little clarity, and then I'm going to look at my brush, and then I might just kind of brush in a little bit more in some areas without going too crazy. Take that down just a little bit. and maybe smooth it right through here. Do a new one and just smooth it right through here a little. You see that kind of took out that gray. I'm going to make my brush a little smaller and just hit that a little bit. And this time I'll go back without exposure, but just highlight in white. And just touch that in there so it's blending up a little bit nicer. Okay. So now it's time to go back and really kind of work on those cliffs to try and give a little bit more depth in there. And the first thing I'm going to do is start with a radial. And I'm going to take it out of the highlight a little bit here. And I'm going to play with exposure first. And then once you do exposure, I've got highlight and whites turned up, and I've got clarity. So clarity, you can see how it adds contrast in there and really starts to pop the highlights because it's separating the midtones. So I want to make sure my feather's good, my invert's good. I'm going to do another one right here. A little bigger. I'm going to, whoop, I meant to turn that. So I'm going to turn that, extend it over a little bit, bring this up, pump the clarity. And now you can almost see that I've got, and I'm going to grab a brush real quick. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go and try and create a little bit of highlight back in here so that that rock face pops out of there a little bit more. And it looks like it's behind there. So now you've got the rock kind of adding dimension, which is something that we had a little bit of trouble with in this image. I'm going to get another quick radial here and just bring out a little detail in this corner. Just a little. Maybe a little bit down here. I'm going to get a new one and I'm going to go over here to this rock face. And I'm going to go ahead and take a peek at this. The more I can add clarity and the more detail I can have, I'm going to take that down just a little, or add a little black in there. I'm going to move that around a little bit so you can see how that's working and bringing out the texture and detail up there, right? Bring it down a little. You might catch the top edge of that water and help blend that right in there. And then I'm going to do another one because there's a little shelf up here that I noticed earlier when I was looking at it for detail, and I'm just going to try and bring out that shelf. So let's just go in here. Of course, that's way too much right now, but if I just do this, extend it a little, move it over here, it appears to be just catching a little light from this backlight way back here. So if I work with just the highlights or the whites, it'll add a little contrast. I can make it a little darker with the black. And so now I just have a little highlight up there. It might be just a little too much. I'm going to go and get this right here. And I think I can kind of get the same effect here. Oh, that's way too much. Just want a little bit more tone there. So now you can see I've got a look. This is not really looking good. Let me just pull that down. It's a little too much. That's a little too much. It just needs to be subtle. And if I want to really smooth these things out, what I'll do is I'll double click this. I'll blend a little bit with the adjustment brush. I can go in here and just open up the shadows a little to try and get that to blend. So you can see how that's kind of starting to blend in there. Okay. Now I'm going to close this real quick, and what I want to do now is I want to look at my tone curve on the overall. I'm just going to take my highlights up a little. Let's see what my lights are doing here. So I'm starting to lose the detail, and I mentioned before that I would go back and look at these. So if I click these, you can kind of see where the highlights are. Again, one of my favorite things to do is to make sure that I hold detail in here. I'm going to take the black down or up just a little, and then I can paint that detail back in there. So you can see how I can kind of go in there and clean that up, depending on how much you want to do, how much detail or how black you want it to go. And then I'll get a new brush and I'll do the same thing with my highlights. Take my highlights down, or just the white, and just kind of paint the detail back in there. So just the whites will be the very hottest spots. You can see my blacks came back a little bit. Anyway, so all right, I'm going to close that real quick, and I want to take another look. I'm going to share with you what happens when you go in and I'm going to turn these off for a second. But if you start playing with clarity and things like that, it just gets so contrasty and the tonal range is just not there, right? So that's why I use selective clarity instead of overall clarity on these kinds of things. And then it also helps when you go to print it too, because if everything is sharp and high contrast, you lose that range. And then when you go to print it, sometimes it's just a pile of specular highlights and not enough depth and consistency in the image to really be enjoyable. One other thing I could do, and I haven't done this really much, but I'm going to go in here, I'm going to reset this, and then I just want to look at what happens if I soften that a little bit or if I harden it a little bit. I can harden it and then take the highlights, so just the whites pop, and I get more streaks out of the waterfall. I'm going to thin that up a little bit, turn it a smidge, and then clarity versus no clarity. And it's interesting, when you go with a little more clarity, you get this nice black streak here. So let me share one other thing that I'm going to do here. I'm going to go in and I'm going to close that real quick. I'm going to get an adjustment brush. Let me take this to 1 to 1. Now you'll see that the falls up here is kind of gray at the top. I want to make sure that I kind of smooth that out. So I'm going to take an adjustment brush. I'm going to double click this. My feather looks good. I'm going to take my flow down a little, because once I start blending up here, it can get a little, just a little exposure, a little highlight, a little white. And then you'll be able to paint in here. And it's kind of hard to see right now, but then I can go in here and I can start, that's just too much, making it a little smaller. We'll get a new one. Just trying to bring out the edges a little bit. A little bit of flow over the top. Now again, I can go into the luminance and I can use the range mask a little bit here. And I can just pick the highlights or the shadows. So I'm going to move it down here a little. And hopefully I'm just working a little bit on the highlights. We'll go fill. And it's not exactly the smoothest thing in the world, but you'll see how it's kind of up here. You'll see my mask. So let me move that mask real quick. And then let me put it back on. Just trying to get a little highlight up there in the upper range. So I'm just going to just a couple little places. I just want to pop this a little over here, smooth it out, and it's starting to look pretty good. Now I don't know how it compares to the other one. I think it's a little bit more open and dark compared to my other one. Okay, at this point, generally what I like to do is I like to walk away from the image and, you know, kind of come back to it later. I didn't really have a chance to walk away. I took a couple of minutes. But I have noticed a couple of things while I'm just kind of sitting here looking at it. And I'm going to go back into the Develop module. And I want to take a peek at some of these areas right here. I think I want to boost these just a little to add a little bit more snap and contrast into them. So go with the whites, but I'm going to also pull the black down a little so it gets just a little bit moodier in the shadows. And then I want to pump the, I think I liked it better when it was a little brighter up here and the highlights were popping and the clarity. So I'm going to just do those things, and then I want to take one more look down here. I think this looks a little better when it's a little brighter and that mist is going a little bit farther. So I'm going to take the exposure down, but I'm going to try and white is not doing much. Let's try this. Actually, it needs just a little bit of that exposure so it's going over the rocks a little bit more. I'm noticing a little bit of a highlight up here over the sky, so I probably want to take a look at that. And I don't know if that was, you know, for me using the adjustment brush. I think I want to probably take that up a little bit. And I will probably go down, smooth that out a little bit later on. Make sure I don't have that, you know, up there. You know, I could actually, I see how it's affecting it over here as well, but so I could do the brush, I could do the erase, and then just go back here and bring that back in. Make sure I don't lose some of that, those highlights and stuff that I was trying to pull out before. So I like that a little bit better. I don't know, let's see how it compares to the other one. We just hit tab real quick. Now that highlight might be a little too much. I got a, you know, nice texture in here. This is kind of nice the way it's a little darker. So, and a little softer over here. I like this rock better in this one with a little detail. I like the way this goes behind it. I like the water here a little better. I like the texture here a little better. I like the way I've kind of smoothed out that sky and have a little bit different glow. I've got a little bit more detail in my water. I can see some areas in here where I could just kind of smooth that out so that the white coming down is a little bit more consistent from top to bottom like it is here. So I might go back with a brush and just kind of clean that up. But, you know, again, I'll walk away from this and I'll come back, you know, in a week or two and I'll look at it and I'll do some more comparison. I'll go back in and I'll fix this thing just a little bit and make sure we're in good shape. You know, from where we were before in our original raw file, we had a very short dynamic range and we ended up here. And if I just hit the Y key real quickly, you'll see the difference in the lack of detail over here, the very short dynamic range, as I said, and no depth, texture, and luminosity. When we get to the other side here, we now have these outlined of these cliffs here with the highlights and texture. We have depth behind. We have depth, you know, dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, all the way up through the frame. We now have luminosity in the waterfall. So we're starting to see quite a bit more interest going through the frame. I think we got pretty close. There could be some more touch-ups to do, but you know, probably up around the sky, use maybe a little bit more range filter or range brush, the range tool, and see where we can get it, you know, kind of finalized to a master print file. All right. Thanks. I appreciate you coming and visiting and watching my my Mastery of Light series video tutorials, and I hope you'll come back soon. Have a great day.